This is going to be a little bit of different video for me and my various channels, and that is because a dear friend of mine just passed away. And I just found this out on Facebook because somebody posted it and said, by the way, just to let everyone know that Chris Goodsell has passed away. And Chris is a guy I never met face to face. He lived in Australia, and I live in the US. And I've mentioned before a few times that I love being on different media out there. And if somebody puts a microphone or a camera in front of me and says, Steve, talk, I'll talk to you, tell me to shut up. And Chris hosted a show called Road Ramblings in Australia, and also it was syndicated in New Zealand as well. And it was a weekly show where he talked about automotive culture in Australia. And the way I met him was kind of interesting because I started thinking about this after I saw the news of his passing on Facebook. And years ago, I started doing research for a book I wrote called Preston Tucker, and it was Battle to Build the Car of Tomorrow. And there are a bunch of Tucker automobiles out there. And I was purposely looking for stories about interesting ones because other than the color, they all look alike. There's a couple minor distinctions, but for the most part, you've seen one, you've seen them all. But they each have fascinating stories as to how they got where they are. Some are in museums, there's one in the Smithsonian. Some are in other countries. There's, I believe, 2 in Japan. And there's at least 1 in Australia. And I was tracking down different Tuckers, trying to find some good stories about some particular Tuckers. And I ran across a reference that said there's a Tucker in Australia. And so I read this article that was written, I believe, by Chris Goodsell about the Australian Tucker. So I sent him an email and just said, hey, I'm doing research on this. And he emailed me back, and very, very nice guy. And we had a great correspondence going about Tuckers and Australian car culture. And he said, what do you do besides, write books and stuff? And I said, well, at the time I had a podcast. I said, I've got a podcast. I write about cars also for either Jalopnik or roadandtrack.com at that time. And I said, and I've got a website, Lehto's Law. And I don't think I was doing videos just yet, but I may have been about to start. I'd have to do the math on that. And he said, hey, I got a question for you. He goes, would you be interested in coming on my show periodically and speaking about American automotive news, car stuff in America? And I said, I'd love to. I'd love to. And so he said, well, how about this? And he gave me a time. He goes, you call in via Skype. You'll call in via Skype, and we'll talk. I'll record it, and then we will play it on Road Ramblings across all the various stations that carry Road Ramblings. And I said, great. And was doing this now for, I think, about 5 years, maybe more than that. 6 or 7 years maybe even, but it goes back quite a ways. And so as some of you know, I've moved around a couple times in the last few years. I was doing this the whole time. Once a month, I'd have a phone call with Chris, and Chris would let me talk about anything I wanted, but it was a 2 or 3 minute long segment. And at one point in time, he said, let's get an introduction for your piece, The American Car Report. So a good friend of mine named Tom, who I've mentioned before, Tom Spademan, is a musician, and he has an American accent like I do. So his voice introduced me over a musical riff, and then Chris would say hello to me, and then I would do my report, and then there'd be an outro, and that'd be it. But once a month when we spoke, there's a big time difference. So he would be in the studio in Australia in the morning, and I'd be at my studio in the evening. And I wasn't, for the most part, using this studio. I'd often use a different setup with a different microphone because we're using Skype. And we would often have conversations before I did my report. So I hadn't talked to him in a month, and I'd pick up the Skype call. And hey, Steve, how you doing? Good, Chris, how you doing? And we'd just make chit-chat, And so I had just recently told him about my Cobra. And I'd sent him the video, and we were talking about the Cobra, and I was explaining to him how fun it was, but how I drove it home in the cold. We're always comparing weather, because where he was in Australia, they don't get as much snow as we do in Michigan, apparently. And we would talk about these things, but we often talked about the state of car culture these days, electrification and how that's going to affect those of us who drive cars that use gasoline. And, just differences in culture, because, the way cars are treated in America, It's a very different thing. Australia, I think, is actually more akin to Americans with how they love their cars and so on, compared to some European cities, for instance. But be that as it may, we'd have these great discussions about cars, and he loved me talking about hot rods, and I was talking to him about my Viper also. And he test drove a lot of vehicles for his show, and also motorcycles. And so it was always a great discussion. And I spoke to him literally last week. And during the conversation, he coughed a couple times. And I said, "Hey, you doing okay over there?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm fine, because I've got this lingering cough, but I'll be fine. And I was poking around the internet today, and I took a break, and I flipped over to Facebook, and I saw a post that just said road ramblings, and there's a picture of Chris, and it says, "We're sorry to announce that Chris passed away." He had some lingering health issues, and apparently they got the better of him, and he's gone. And it's shocking because I had just talked to him so recently, and I know that's a recurring theme when you talk to somebody and they tell you about somebody who's passed away recently. If you've spoken to that person recently, you kind of feel like, I had no idea that anything that serious was going on. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know. And he certainly wasn't trying to burden me with his health issues. He's like, no, I'm fine. And, every single time we talked, we would have a bit of catching up because we hadn't spoken in a month. I would do my car report where he would literally say, "I'm going to hit record, wait 10 seconds. And then he'd say, 'Hey, Steve, how you doing?' And then I'd do my report, and that would be the end of it. He'd come back in, we'd make some more small talk, and then he'd say, 'Okay, how about 1 month from today?' or whatever. And we'd actually schedule the next phone call. And once in a while, he'd send me a note and he'd say, 'Steve, I can't get in the studio at 8 o'clock on Monday. Can we do 8 o'clock on Tuesday?' That kind of thing. But generally speaking, it was these conversations we had once a month that preceded and followed the recording of this little report I did called the American Car Report. And it's just shocking because, like I said, I just talked to him a couple days ago, and it's sudden. And I know that these things are often this way. And so I'm just telling you this because I know that some of you who've been with me for many, many years, as many of you have been, know that I often joke about all of the different kinds of things I do. So I say, look, I practice law. I do videos on YouTube. I've got a podcast you can hear on iTunes, which is the audio version of this video. I write books. I write magazine articles. I answer questions for other people. I appear on shows. And I used to jokingly say, and oh, by the way, I appear once a month on the radio in Australia. And to me, that was always one of those things that he didn't pay me to do it. And I wouldn't want to get paid to do it because it was so much fun to do. And I used to jokingly tell people that, yeah, I think he has me on so they can enjoy my funny accent. Because Americans think the Australian accent is charming. But of course, if you're Australian, it's just your accent. So I assume that you find our accent as charming as we find yours, but I could be wrong on that. But I've always felt that way. But, I have in the back of my mind a resume that I have for myself. And so if somebody ever actually said, "Steve, quick, give me the one-page list of things you've done," I could spell out all the different types of cases I've handled or all the different radio stations I worked at. But I would summarize most of those in one sentence. I practiced law for 32 years. I worked at 10 different radio stations. And then I'd say things like, well, I was also quoted by the New York Times, or I've appeared on the BBC. And I used to say, and I appear monthly on a syndicated radio program in Australia. And it was, to me, just one of those things. It was an opportunity presented itself. And I got to know Chris. He's a great guy. He's a great guy. I mean, we were on pretty much, I'd have to take a look at a globe to figure this out, but pretty much opposite sides of the sphere, right? But I talk to him once a month, and through the wonders of modern technology, when you hear the recording of me on the American Car Report, I sound like I'm in the studio with the guy. And I felt like I was. And that's how that often goes in broadcasting. And so, he would always take the piece I just did, edit it, and then he would send me a copy of it, and it would be attached to an email. And the email would say, "Hey, Steve, thanks for today. Attached is the American Car Report. And by the way, looking forward to our talk next month on the 27th," or whatever it was. And so I got that email from him on the 3rd, and it had the attachment. And because I'd done this in the evening, it came over on 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. And so I just put it in there, and I made a note on my calendar that we're going to talk next month. Actually, we're going to talk at the end of this month because we got thrown off by the holidays. And so, sadly, not going to talk to him anymore. And so, I just baffled, saddened, and I don't know what else to say. I'll play you a small clip from the last American Car Report and say goodbye to my good friend, Chris Goodsell.
The American Car Report with Steve Lehto.
G'day, Steve, and a Happy New Year to you, mate.
And to you too, my friend. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. Now today, of course, one man that's continually in the news is Elon Musk with Tesla, and General Motors have dumped something that really is out of the blue.